Let's talk first of all about Trump, if we may, because it is the story of the weekend. As you well know, there's a mocked-up mugshot of the former US president in the Mail on Sunday. Do you think that if this legal process goes ahead, that he should still run for US president?
Well, that's clearly not a matter for a British commentator as to whether he ought to or not.
You might voice an opinion, I thought, with all of your wealth of political experience.
From the perspective of any candidate, if he's in the circumstances he is in the moment, he's got to come to a judgment. Is this actually going to help his campaign or not? And Trump is a pretty unattractive character, much more than he was 8 years ago, even without this indictment. But to have a criminal indictment, because this isn't just a one-day event, this is going to dominate the headlines for the next few weeks, possibly, almost certainly the next few months. And even people who think that he shouldn't have been charged will forget whether he should or shouldn't have been. The whole subject will be former president in court day after day, defending himself on a criminal charge. But
do you think it's an own goal then for the so-called left-leaning lawyers? The whole city of New York seems to have wanted to get Trump, and now they've got him because he's now got another, I think it's $4 million in the coffers. He's become a poster boy for kind of, you know, a witch hunt of the right. Actually, it's emboldened his campaign.
Well, first of all, this isn't the only indictment he's likely to face. There are 3 or 4 other investigations going on at the moment. And I think it's a bit difficult to just assume that there's a political purpose behind them. The United States prosecution system can sometimes, one suspects, be influenced by political considerations. But here you have a unique situation of a president when he was in office, and it's not so much this charge, it's a question, for example, did he incite people to try and break the law to declare that the election had been invalid? Was he involved in the riots in the Capitol? Now, these will be even more serious, and the very fact that he's having to face these kind of accusations, in my judgment, if you're asking me, should prove to anyone who had any doubts how totally useless and dangerous he would be if he was again to become president of the United States, not just for the Americans, but for the world as a whole.
Talking about the US presidential race, we now hear that Biden is seriously considering running for a second term. That will mean he's 86, I believe. Is that just a term too many for Biden?
Well, it is extraordinary that in a country of, 300 million people, they have to have as the 2 possible presidential candidates, one in his 80s and one who will be in his 80s if he was to succeed. So it is about time, I would have thought, as an external friend of America and observer, it really is about time both the Democrats and the Republicans look to the next generation. I mean, I find myself now in my mid-70s being ridiculously underused, when if only I was an American, I might have been about to enter the White House.
You would be at the prime of your career. So
well, the future would not be what it used to be.
But it is a bit of a Hobson's choice, isn't it? And do you think that does have a destabilising effect on the rest of the world?
Well, only in the sense that it creates maximum uncertainty.
Yes.
Because, I mean, if it's Biden versus Trump, I hope to God it's Biden who wins. But you never know, will he be able to complete his term? Not just will he be alive. I mean, maybe he just would become so ill because of some other problem that he'd have to hand over. So the choice of vice president then becomes crucially important. Kamala Harris, the current vice president, is not seen as a very strong holder of that office. But will it be possible to have a new candidate? And if so, who might that be?
Let's talk about Russia now. Yesterday, they took on ownership of the leadership of the UN Security Council.
Yes.
That will strike many people as ridiculous and preposterous.
Yes, I agree with them if they feel that, but don't read too much into that.
Right.
The person who chairs the Security Council literally does no more than that. They don't decide the outcome. And you have 5 permanent members.
It's not great optics, though, is it?
Well, there are various things about it. It's not very the optics of having a president in the Kremlin who has invaded his neighbouring country and caused total carnage and hundreds of thousands of loss of lives and people injured, of his own citizens as well as Ukrainians. That's not very good optics either.
Quite.
So compared with that, I don't frankly care who chairs the Security Council. It's a temporary thing. It goes in rotation. It's what the Security Council does or doesn't do that is much more important.
And do you have a view on China being blocked from any participation in this new CPTPP deal?
I better ask you to repeat the initial.
I know.
No, don't
even think about it. This has been bugging me all morning.
Yes, you're talking about.
Should we just say the deal?
You're talking about the Asia-Pacific
trade deal that we've done.
And
Liz Truss has said China shouldn't be a part of this.
Well, the irony is that this organisation was created as a counter to Chinese expansion. Because one of the foolish things that Xi Jinping has done, he's a very, in many ways, very impressive guy, but his strategic judgment is useless. Because his main target, as we all know, is Taiwan.
Yes. And
he would admit that. And yet what does he do? He has, over the last 3 or 4 years, forget America, forget Europe, forget even Australia, he's alienated every one of his Asian neighbours, Japan, India, Vietnam, the countries of Southeast Asia, by having territorial claims on them as well, and by taking them forward. So here you have someone who has managed to unite all the Asian neighbours, so that Vietnam, think of the history of Vietnam and America. Vietnamese minister recently said, today America is our partner, China is the country we're worried about. India, which during the Cold War always was non-aligned, we don't take sides. India has just joined what's called the Quad with the United States, Japan and Australia to discuss how to contain China. Now, these things would not have happened but for the foolish judgments made by Xi Jinping, who's a bit like Putin in that sense. He has got so much power, he doesn't listen to anybody else. And just as he mucked up China's handling of COVID, he's mucked up their foreign policy as well. And that's serious stuff.
What was your reaction to those two meeting a couple of weeks ago? I mean, does that tell us anything new that we didn't know already?
Well, it's a very interesting question you're asking me, because you see, what is presented by both of them, Putin and Xi Jinping, we're allies, we're close chums, we are inseparable. And to some degree, that is true. They're both authoritarian leaders who dislike the West, who dislike the United States, and are trying to create an alternative. But the Chinese are much smarter than the Russians. Because when it comes to it, when the United Nations votes to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine, China doesn't vote for that motion, but doesn't vote against it either. It abstains. Now, that's not what your best chum should be doing. And China has, for example, also refused to recognize Putin's annexation of these various parts of Ukraine as if they're now part of Russia. He won't do that. And we also know that Xi Jinping was one of the people, very important here, that got through to Putin saying, under no circumstances threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Because we will not support you. And the reason they won't support them is not just because they are trying to be helpful to Ukraine. It's because the Chinese are very worried if you have a precedent, for the first time since Hiroshima, of a non-nuclear weapon state being threatened by a nuclear state, then guess what will happen on China's border? Japan, South Korea, Taiwan will say, well, if you need nuclear weapons to defend yourself from your big neighbour, maybe we should start thinking.
But then it sounds to me as if you're nearing the position of Russia sort of being a client state of China. I mean, it's not quite that pronounced,
It's not a client state, but the Russians have to be very, very careful. Because as a result, for example, again, Putin's stupidity, their biggest market for their gas was Germany and Europe. That's now gone. 100% of it will be gone in literally weeks from now. It will never come back. Now, when you're dealing with gas, it's not like oil. Oil you can sell, put it on a ship. You can take it anywhere and sell it at a discount. Gas needs pipelines. There aren't any pipelines at the moment, and won't be for 10 years.
Are you happy with the government's rhetoric on China, though? The integrated review refresh of 2023 has said that China poses an epoch-defining challenge. Is that strong enough language?
Actually, yes, I think it is. It's a good question, and let me answer it. I think you still have to make a very clear distinction between how we deal with Russia for the time being, because of the invasion of Ukraine, and China. Russia has actually invaded its neighbour, causing it's in the middle of a huge war against its neighbour who is trying to defend itself. Xi Jinping might do that against Taiwan. He's not done it yet. And therefore, China is hugely important. I have always taken the view, even with Russia, that you are not making a concession by dialogue. You have to have dialogue, but in the case of China also, China, unlike Russia, is massively integrated in the global economy.
So do you think Liz Truss was too hawkish?
I think her language was too hawkish. I don't think the policy changed. Well, she only had 46 days. Limit to what you can do in 46 days.
I mean, as Foreign Secretary, I suppose.
But the language, I think there is a tendency, it's become sort of the norm, to be hawkish on China. Well, it depends what you mean by hawkish. If it means you've got to talk tough about what happens if China attacks its neighbours, not just Taiwan, but also India, also other countries that have territory that it claims. You've got to be very tough on that. But if is it too late to have a proper cooperative relationship with China on other matters. For example, on climate change, on nuclear weapons, on environmental issues. There's a range of issues where if the Chinese wish to, which they probably do, there can not only be dialogue, but you could actually make some serious progress.
I want to ask you about Israel in just a moment, but just briefly, General Sir Richard Barrons has talked this week about Britain needing to have 5 to 10 years' notice from Vladimir Putin should he wish to stage a Russian attack. Are we adequately defended in this country? The spending for defence has gone up to, I think, 2.25 of GDP. People wanted 3%.
Well, you're speaking to a former defence secretary, so I don't object if the defence budget is increased. I think that would be very desirable. But if you're asking me a more fundamental question, does Russia pose a military threat?
I think more of a question of, is Britain adequately defended, or have we actually depleted our armed forces to too much of an extent?
Well, we have the 5th largest defence budget in the world. So compared to the vast majority of countries, we certainly spend a lot more on defence than most of the world does. Only United States and China spend more than we do.
So are we spending enough?
Well, what does enough mean? I was going to make the point, if the Russian government under Putin has shown himself to be useless at trying to defeat Ukraine, next door, a much weaker country, a much smaller population, the idea that Russia could defeat NATO. The defence budget of NATO is 10 times greater than that of Russia. Its armed forces are infinitely more sophisticated. And if the Russians cannot even make progress a few miles in the Donbass, the idea that they could sweep across Europe is absurd. That doesn't mean, sorry, forgive me.
Yes.
That doesn't mean you don't have to have strong defence.
Sure.
You have to do it to stop them trying to exploit gaps in your defence that could create problems for the Baltic states or for other countries.
And a quick word on Israel, Sir Malcolm, because I know you wanted to talk about that, these protests against these judicial reforms, which I think Netanyahu has now backed down on slightly, but it's not a good situation. What's your view on that?
Well, some people say democracy is under threat around the world. What has been extraordinary and very encouraging in Israel is that when there was a comparable threat, and there may still be one, from Netanyahu's government, we have over 1 million Israelis, not just once, day after day, week after week, over the last 2 months, coming out in vast numbers, and the government has to bend the knee. Now, that shows that although Israel has big problems at the moment, it's not one of those countries where the government can ignore civil liberties, ignore the rule of law, and seem to get away with it.
And that's probably encouraging.
That's hugely encouraging, not just for Israel, but it shows that civic society, ordinary people who value their freedom, who value the rule of law, can combine and prevent even what seems to be the most powerful government from achieving its objective. Now, the Israel story is not yet finished, but so far it's the people of Israel who are winning, and it's the government that are losing.